Some of the smartest things our species ever did happened before anyone could write them down. No metal, no wheel, no writing. Just people staring down a frozen, half-dead planet and somehow inventing solutions so clever that modern scientists, when they finally dug them up, assumed they had to be wrong. They weren't wrong. Ice Age humans were doing things that sound less like survival and more like science fiction. Stick with me, because by the end of this you'll never look at primitive the same way again. Let's start with the one that sounds completely impossible. Crossing an ocean with no idea what's on the other side. Around 65,000 years ago, a group of humans in Southeast Asia looked out at open water, with no land visible on the horizon, and got in a boat anyway. To reach what's now Australia, they had to cross at least 55 to 80 kilometers of deep, current-choked sea. Not island hopping in sight of shore. Open ocean, out of sight of land, for what researchers estimate may have been several days at sea. No compass, no metal tools, no written knowledge of currents or navigation passed down from anyone. And they didn't do it once. They did it as a large enough group to actually found a population that survived. This is now considered the earliest confirmed open ocean voyage by any human species on Earth. Before agriculture, before the pyramids, before almost anything we associate with civilization, our ancestors were already ocean sailors. But crossing water is nothing compared to what they were doing with something as basic as a rock. Here's a trick that genuinely breaks people's assumptions about intelligence and fire. In coastal South Africa, people figured out that if you bury a certain type of stone under a fire and slow cook it for hours at a controlled temperature, the stone itself changes. It becomes easier to shape, sharper, more predictable to flake into a blade. Archaeologists call it heat treatment, and the earliest solid evidence for it goes back roughly 72,000 years, with hints it may stretch as far back as 164,000 years. Researchers who tried to recreate the process needed up to 40 kilograms of wood and nearly 30 hours of carefully maintained heat to pull it off. This wasn't an accident from someone cooking dinner too close to their tools. This was a deliberate, multi-day industrial process, run by people who understood exactly what fire does to rock on a molecular level, tens of thousands of years before anyone had a word for chemistry. They were engineering their raw materials before they even shaped them. And once they had those sharper tools, they used them for something that should have been physically impossible for a human being to do at all. Killing a mammoth with a stick should not work. A mammoth can weigh 6 times more than a car. And yet Ice Age hunters brought them down regularly enough to build entire settlements out of their bones. The trick wasn't strength. It was leverage and geography. Around 17,000 to 20,000 years ago in Ice Age Europe, hunters were using a tool called an otlotl, essentially a handle that acts like an extension of the arm, roughly doubling the speed and force of a thrown spear compared to a bare hand throw. That difference in leverage meant hunters could wound a massive animal from a safer distance instead of walking up and stabbing it. But the real genius was using the land itself as a weapon. Hunters studied migration routes and drove herds toward cliffs, bogs, or narrow ravines, letting the terrain do most of the killing. A group of humans with sharpened sticks couldn't outmuscle a mammoth. But a group of humans who understood physics, geography, and animal behavior could turn an entire valley into a trap. Now here's where it gets almost unbelievable. A piece of technology so basic you've probably never thought about it twice, that turns out to be one of the oldest inventions of any human species, and it wasn't even invented by us. String. Just string. In France, archaeologists found a fragment of twisted cord, made from tree bark fibers, twisted one direction and then twisted again the opposite way to lock the structure together, exactly the way rope is still made today. It's around 50,000 years old, and it wasn't made by Homo sapiens. It was made by Neanderthals. Researchers point out that making cord like this requires tracking multiple steps at once, understanding tree growth cycles well enough to harvest bark fiber at exactly the right time of year, and a level of abstract sequencing that looks a lot like the mental math behind language itself. Cord like this is the basis for nets, snares, fishing line, clothing, bags, and eventually boats. An entire hidden technology tree, running quietly underneath everything else on this list, made by a species we spent decades assuming was too dumb to matter. And it wasn't just tools that kept people alive out there. It was who they knew hundreds of kilometers away. This next one sounds less like survival and more like a social strategy. Archaeologists studying Ice Age Europe have found tools and jewelry made from materials that traveled over 700 kilometers from their original source, crossing entire mountain ranges to end up in someone's camp. Shells that could only have come from a distant coastline. Ivory carved in one region, found buried in another, hundreds of kilometers away. This wasn't trade in the modern sense. There was no money changing hands. What researchers believe they're looking at is something closer to an insurance policy. Small, scattered human groups deliberately maintained relationships and exchanged goods with other groups they might never meet more than once or twice in a lifetime. If your local area failed, if the herds didn't show up or the winter ran too long, you had somewhere to turn. And the evidence suggests these long-distance networks got stronger exactly when conditions got worse, meaning people responded to crisis not by isolating, but by reaching further outward. They were running a continent-wide support system with nothing but foot travel and word of mouth. Somewhere in the middle of all this, humans also managed to turn one of the most dangerous predators on the Ice Age landscape into a teammate. Sometime between roughly 15,000 and 30,000 years ago, during the depths of the last ice age, a population of gray wolves started the long process of becoming something else entirely. Genetic evidence confirms dogs, clearly distinct from wolves both biologically and in how they were treated by humans, were already living alongside people at least 14,000 to 16,000 years ago. Isotope analysis of bones from one side even shows early dogs were deliberately fed a fish-heavy diet that matched what the humans themselves were eating. Not scraps. Actual care. Once that relationship existed, everything about survival got easier. Dogs could track wounded animals across snow, warn a camp of approaching predators long before a human would notice, and haul weight across terrain no sled could cross alone. Humans didn't just survive the Ice Age. At some point during it, they recruited an entire second species to help them do it. Now for one of the strangest clues left behind. Statues of women, carved in exaggerated detail, found scattered from Spain all the way to Russia. They're usually called Venus figurines, small carved statuettes, often made from mammoth ivory, showing the female body with heavily emphasized proportions, especially around body fat. They start appearing roughly 30,000 years ago, and versions of them turn up across an enormous span of the continent. Many archaeologists interpret them as symbols tied to fertility and survival, since in an environment where starvation was a constant threat, visible body fat wasn't just an aesthetic. It was a sign of health, of surviving a hard season, of being able to carry a pregnancy through a famine. Whether that theory is fully correct is still debated. But the sheer geographic spread of these figures, showing up with strikingly similar features thousands of kilometers apart, tells you something on its own. Ideas were moving across the Ice Age world just as far and as fast as the trade goods were. And with ideas moving that far, ancient humans needed something almost nobody gives them credit for, a way to keep track of time and numbers without writing a single word. Long before anyone invented a written number system, people were notching bones with tally marks, sequences of small cuts organized in patterns that some researchers believe track lunar cycles or running counts of days, animals, or resources. It's essentially a physical spreadsheet carved into bone. It let a person track something over weeks or months without relying purely on memory, which mattered enormously when the difference between rationing correctly and running out of food early could decide who made it to spring. It's easy to assume math started with agriculture and cities. The evidence suggests people were already doing structured counting deep in the Ice Age, using nothing but a sharp tool and a piece of bone. So here's what all of this adds up to. An ocean crossed with no land in sight. Stone cooked like food to change its molecular structure. Mammoths brought down using leverage and geography instead of brute force. String invented by a species we underestimated for decades. Support networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, built specifically to survive disaster. Wolves turned into partners. Symbols carried across an entire continent. And numbers tracked in bone, long before anyone thought to write a single word. None of this was luck, and none of it was primitive. It was engineering, logistics, and cooperation, running at a scale that most people assumed didn't exist until civilization showed up. The Ice Age nearly erased our species more than once. And every single time, the answer wasn't brute strength. It was creativity that refused to quit.